It's Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Switzerland, and it's Space Café WebTalk time. Our Space Café WebTalk 33 minutes with Dr. Bleddyn Bowen will begin soon. Thank you for joining us for this exciting and very informative event. We know we have a very informed audience with all of you for this event today. As always, we appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. I'm Thorsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly newsletters, daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. I'm very proud to say that we published the episode 5 of our podcast, featuring Simon Gwatch from Equatorial Space Systems in Singapore. We called it the Simon, the Elon of Singapore. This episode had over 3,000 downloads just on our website alone, not talking about all these major platforms. Check it out and leave us your comments or emails at podcast@spacewatch.global. We are keen to get your feedback and, of course, your rating. If you missed, in the unlikely event that you missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website in the event section, and now we are also on YouTube as well. We host our Space Café web talks on a weekly basis. It is already the 14th edition, and I hope you mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendar. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by a very special guest, Dr. Bleddyn Bowen. Bleddyn is lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester, specialized in space warfare and classical military philosophy, and teaches astropolitics, Cold War history, and modern warfare. He has published in several academic journals, is a regular columnist on SpaceWatch.Global, what we are very proud of, and provides advice and insight to practitioners on UK space policy, military doctrine, and European space policy. Today, we are talking about his new book, published today, on this day. War in Space, Strategies, Spacepower, Geopolitics, published by the Edinburgh University Press, which has been lauded by Peter Hayes of the Space Policy Institute as the largest contribution to space power in a generation. Big words. He joins us from the newly established lockdown in Leicester, and I'm proud to welcome Dr. Bleddyn Bowen today. Bleddyn, the floor is yours. What makes your book that special?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Thorsten, and thank you to SpaceWatch.Global for having this launch event for me today. Hopefully in the next sort of few minutes, I'll be able to give you some justification, hopefully, for Peter Hayes' very, very generous comments about the book and my research. Coming to you live from lockdown Leicester, which was imposed last night, unfortunately. But thankfully, that does not derail our event here today. So I can still talk to you from the comfort of my own home today. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of text here on the slide, but I'm going to go through each one fairly succinctly, so don't feel like you have to jump through all that text straight away. So there's quite a lot of stuff in that book, as it's the product of about 8 years of research in many different institutions, and was originally my PhD thesis, and spent the last sort of 3-4 years working on turning it into the research monograph that it is today. And in a nutshell, it's pretty much Carl von Clausewitz in space. So if you know any classical military philosophy, it's basically transposing those ideas firmly rooted in Clausewitz's contribution to military thought, and applying those to outer space. And that is where sort of the first point of my argument, or the starting point of thinking about space politics and the role of war in space in space politics takes place. It's space warfare is the continuation of terran politics by the means. And for those of you who know your Clausewitz will know that I've pretty much just paraphrased Clausewitz almost entirely there. So space war or space warfare is still warfare. It still takes part in the wider social phenomenon that we call war. So in terms of basic concepts and political investigation and character, or nature rather, space warfare is not that different to war at all. It is still a political activity. It is still subject to human emotions, human irrationalities, to the realm of chance, and subject to human leadership and will as well. So all those things that make up war in a conceptual sense, they still apply in space, even though there's no actual humans in space, and we are mostly talking about machines flying around in Earth orbit. And from that starting point, in the book, I look at what Seapower Theory, so the study of navies in wars, and how to use sea power in wars. What insights do they have to think about outer space? And this has been done by quite a few authors over the decades, and they can help answer such questions as, how important is war in space to winning a war in general? Could winning space battles decide the outcome of a war on the whole? And in my own arguments are that wars won't necessarily start in space, as many analysts like to say. It could start in space. The first shots of a major war could be taking out satellites, but it could not be either. War is a very uncertain thing, and so is space warfare. And also, even if you win certain engagements in space, if you successfully deny the use of space to your adversaries, you won't necessarily win the entire war yourself. So, even in the last 30 years, space superiority or even dominance or dominating that ultimate higher ground of space hasn't given the US military complete freedom on Earth, and has actually faced significant military upsets here on Earth, even though it's going up against adversaries that have no means of challenging American supremacy in space. So what a lot of existing space power theory does is based on blue water or island power based thinking about the sea and sea power and navies. And they take a very hegemonic or dominant and very imperial view of the sea. They think about the sea as something that is large and expansive, and quite distant as well, and that the theatre of operations of the enemy is across the sea usually as well, and it's about projecting power to somewhere quite far away. That's what you get from a lot of the existing space power literature when they make analogies from the sea to space. And whilst they get a lot of the fundamental concepts right, it's not the whole picture about space operations and the way we use space power in conflict today in Earth orbit. So what I bring in to the space power landscape, and hopefully justify Peter Hayes's comments about the new insights, is that I use continental or land power based sea power insights. How did continental powers approach sea power as opposed to island powers? So France, Russia, India, China, they have very different attitudes towards and experiences of maritime wars and navies compared to Britain and America. Britain and America being blue water island-based powers, or having to project their power across oceans. Whereas sea power is very different if you're the Soviet Union or Russia or France or India, where you have very significant land threats that you have to deal with. What's the role of sea power in a land-dominated war? And when you apply that thinking to space, you start seeing space more as a coastline, and it shows that space is really a secondary supporting environment for the primary theatre, which is Earth. And it's that supporting role of space technology and space infrastructure in modern warfare that I sort of draw out more in my theory in the book, compared to the existing space power literature that is based on blue water as opposed to continental thinking. So that's sort of the the new insight I bring to the table, and it's building on the contributions of the classical blue water theorists, people like Everett Dolman, John Klein, and Colin Gray. So it's sort of placing their original concepts in maybe a more accurate geographical analogy for a coastline in Earth orbit, because Earth orbit is not very far away in the grand scheme of things either. It begins 100 kilometers up, and also they're within lines of sight in most technological terms as well. So they're not somewhere far away, which is the impression that you get with maritime empires. So you can have, I think space powers today are Earth-based space powers. They are political military entities that live on Earth, and space is a secondary environment. Main threats to the state don't come from space, they come from Earth. So space is secondary to that, and space has to make itself relevant to those threats, in the same way that sea power has to make itself relevant to the land-based threats of any land-based power, because that's what's going to fixate its attention the most in their military and strategic cultures. So that continental analogy also shows that you can project power from Earth into space. Continental powers can challenge island-based powers and their traditional naval superiority with coastal defences. In the same way, you're seeing the spread of anti-satellite weapons that are based on Earth, not space. So the majority of the tools to counter satellites are based on Earth, with only very embryonic, exotic technologies being tested here and there for space-based weapons. So a lot of the analysis from previous works tend to focus on space-based anti-satellite weapons as opposed to Earth-based anti-satellite weapons. Some people do talk about it a bit, but the general feeling of most of the literature, which is also American for the most part as well, focuses on space-based weapons to almost the exclusion of everything else that's going on Earth. And so that has a lot of precedent with continental or land-based thinking about the sea as well. There's also the cultural element as well, and we're seeing that very crudely, I think, with the new Space Force program, about the military culture of a military space service having to justify itself and not be seen as a joke for the other military services which are established, in the same way that navies of continental powers were always seen as a neglected military service. They were a sideshow, or the hobby of some, politicians or leaders of the state, not as a serious part of the land military of the army. So those things do translate into space as well, because it's secondary and quite niche or esoteric in its contributions to war. So hopefully, if there's one analogy that comes out of this book for anyone, is that Earth orbit is really a more of a coastal region for the cosmos. It's not a new ocean. Earth orbit isn't. Beyond Earth orbit, maybe, but for now it's better to see Earth orbit as a coastline, because it's easier to contest it from Earth and is more open to more actors than the oceans are in a time of war as well. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is sort of the last sort of significant slide, so I'll be quiet in a moment. The book as well is structured around these 7 propositions, and you can find these on the website for the book as well, on Edinburgh University Press. It's on the table of contents. And I have these propositions to try and structure critical and creative thought about how to think about what warfare in space looks like and what it means for modern military planners and strategic thinking today. So those arguments I just mentioned come out of these quite dry propositions, which I'm happy to put to leave on the screen, or bring back up later if it's relevant to a question as well, if it's possible to do that. I think one thing to bring out from the end of that as well is on Proposition 7, is that the book ends with what does space power mean for modern warfare today, and that is on its dispersing influence on the battlefield. It's increasing the size of battlefields and making more forces disperse more in physical terms as well. And precision strike weapons that are enabled by space systems allow forces to disperse yet retain their effects of concentration as well. And that's continuing a longer term trend back from the Napoleonic era with better anti-infantry artillery. But I can go into more esoteric military history if the questions go that way. But I think I will stop there before I overwhelm everyone because I'm getting too excited and carried away by this. So if you could just give me the last slide, please. So just a little bit of a plug here for a second launch event. If you want to hear for a more in-depth presentation on the book and also a discussion of it by Professor Chris Newman of Northumbria University, we are having another launch event in a week's time at 3 p.m. British Summer Time via the University of Leicester. So you can click the links there, but do visit the astropoliticsblog.wordpress.com site for more information there, or just find me on Twitter. You'll find the information there as well, or LinkedIn as well. So that's on next week for a more in-depth presentation and discussion on the book's contents as well, if this has whetted your appetite. So that's via Microsoft Teams Live, so that's free, no registration required. Just find the links at the time of the event. So I will leave that there and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And we will put the links in the emails we will send out the next days with a link to the video and the not answered questions. But to have the chance to not answer a question, please come on with your questions. Otherwise, we will go through the list of questions I prepared. I starting with Matt's question here. As China begins to build a blue water navy for Earth to protect its trade routes, how do you see them building their Chinese Space Force, rumored to be moon-based? What's also one of the questions I have on file. So you talked about Earth orbits. What about cislunar and lunar for militaries?
So I think about anything cislunar. I don't think there's much to say about it until there's an actual economy there. And until then, it's all scientific exploration and outposts, much like Antarctica, really. We have to be very careful in talking about the different parts of China's space capabilities. So I would be concerned with sort of conflating everything China does with a military lens. Now, China, of course, does have a very large military drive in space, absolutely. But what it's doing on the moon is purely scientific, really. And unless you see everything that other countries do in space through the same lens, then it's a bit unfair to see China doing that as well. Now, it doesn't help with some of the language the Americans have used in their latest space strategy document, which starts talking about some military role on the moon, as opposed to perhaps just the personnel, because a lot of astronauts have been military personnel or are military personnel, but talking about a more military organizational role is more problematic. So I'd be very wary about talking about, a Chinese tin can on the far side of the moon, which has a potato on it as part of a military plan to dominate cislunar space. So whereas talking about Chinese military space really is about the infrastructure they're building in Earth orbit, the communication satellites, the Beidou navigation satellites, spy satellites, all sorts of tracking and weather satellites as well, which all have military applications, and also the Chinese anti-satellite weapons programs as well. So going beyond Earth orbit, there's not that much going on that's very interesting or exciting from my economic and military perspective, because it's all, science and exploration, really. Give it 200 years maybe, but we're not there yet.
Okay, interesting observation, because there's a clear interest from the Space Force or Air Force in programs looking into cislunar and also our moon as the ultimate high ground. And one of your theses was space is not the high ground anymore, or what is it?
It never was, really. The army spoke about nuking the moon in the late 1950s. They didn't do it. Also, it's easy to write these things And just because something's been written somewhere in some paper or document that circulates in the Pentagon doesn't mean it's going to get there. And part of the problem as well is that when something gets published in China and then gets seized upon by outside observers, they take it as, oh my God, this is what the Chinese leadership are thinking. When, well, no, it's just loads of things get written all the time. Until money is actually spent, systems are actually built, then you can start taking, military interest in cislunar seriously. There's a lot of talk right now, but not a lot of action, and it mimics a lot of talk that's happened on 3 or 4 occasions during the Cold War as well. So at the moment, I'm more skeptical and cautious. Like it's just talk. As far as the ultimate high ground goes, that's a lazy metaphor for just a military advantage. That's all it is, and advantages can be undermined.
That's right. We have a number of questions on the topic of how can a scenario look like if a war breaks out in space, or utter destruction of all space resources, or Simon asks, what are the first targets that get destroyed? So how could such a theater look like? So switching GPS off also.
So the last chapter of the book applies the propositions of the theory to a Taiwan war scenario and looks at the military and strategic calculations of when would it be desirable to launch significant attacks or denial operations against adversary satellites, both from the Chinese and Taiwan perspectives, but also the American perspective as well. I don't get into as much detail as to which specific systems need to be targeted. I look at the effects that you want to generate, because these systems can change over many years, and I wanted to write a book that's going to be relevant for hopefully quite some time, regardless of the specific technological systems in use. And that comes back to dispersion. So much of precision military operations rely on being able to shoot what you see, and that imposes dispersion. If you take that ability away, it makes your forces far more survivable. But you want to have that effect at certain times, and in the last chapter of the book is where I start teasing out, what are the push and pulls of when different parties to the conflict will have most or least incentive to start attacking each other's satellites. And that could be anything from kinetic or nuclear detonations to electronic warfare, cyber intrusions, and things like that. So it'd be far too long conversation to go into more specifics, but I try and tease out what it means from a narrow military sort of campaign perspective at the end of the book.
Okay. Great. We have a few questions around our anti-satellite tests as part of a military activity in space, or how would you define them? There's one question. What was it? Jumps. We look sometimes actively deploying and test hazard weapons, and where the peaceful principles of outer space should be pointed out. So how are we dealing with that context?
The ASAT testing.
Just one follow on. Also on the topic, what is taking out? I mean, if we talk about a big explosion, anti-satellite test, collision, whatever, we create space debris and we can hit into the Kessler syndrome. Is that part of the scenario, or will that happen then by accident?
It could be both. Because the book is a work of theory, it's about charting possibilities and the push and pull of every potential decision that planners and strategist decision makers will have to make. In terms of the peaceful uses of space, well, there's always been that doublespeak since those are codified in the OST, that space should be used and should be used for peaceful purposes, and the use and exploration of space should be open to all. But all the signatories also tacitly agreed that self-defense still matters in space, and self-defense gives you a very wide, interpretation of what that means. And the Americans also have successfully won the argument on non-aggressive uses of space in terms of military satellites. So they provide essential military services. So they enable the use of violence on Earth in different ways, although they're not weapons platforms themselves. And the mimicking of that by everyone else, and also the Soviets also agreed with the Americans at the time with this in the Cold War, that peaceful principles is very aspirational, and it's not sort of hard law, although I'm sure Professor Chris Newman next week might take issue with some of the technicalities there with me, because he's more of the international space law expert. But the practice is very different to quite a surface interpretation of the words used in the Outer Space Treaty, because it still, in practice, gives the states leeway to do what they want. Of course, generating a debris event runs foul of, I think, Article 9 of the OST, if I remember, about negative environmental effects. But again, if it's in the name of self-defense, and if you're in such a conflict where that becomes a tolerable decision, are you going to care about Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty? Especially if you've got thousands of your own people dying on Earth. Who cares about some machines in space? So the calculations will not be what they are right now in a time of high intensity war. And also the Kessler syndrome as well, that we still are figuring out exactly how it would look, especially in the short to medium term. In the long term, absolutely terrible. But if it's like, well, we're not really going to feel anything negative for the first 6 months, we can live with that. That calculation is one of the calculations that could be being made. So again, this is not saying it should be done. It's about the possibilities, and that is some of the possibilities.
I think a few weeks back we made a call for action to support Pluckshare and Jessica West's our ambition to study more about the possible scenarios. It was a lot about all the other activities which might lead then to space-based actions. So cyber attacks in space, critical maneuver. So if my satellite follows you, so wherever you go, or comes close and inspects you, or does things you do when you are close by. So all these behaviors in space are how does that play into that? And we have a number of questions about the regulatory frameworks needed to secure our peaceful activities in space.
Mm-hmm. So I circumvent those topics because the book is really about what happens when the shooting starts. So I'm not talking about deterrence, about how to prevent such a war. I'm thinking through how to think about space power in a time of open warfare. And when it comes to are these actions, how important are these actions to worry about? For me, it's like, are you going to lose this service? Okay, so what? What does it mean? What's the knock-on effect to everything else you want to achieve in this campaign? And what do you need to think about in order to mitigate that? And how does it affect your thinking about the ultimate high ground, or how reliant should you be on those systems? So rather than saying, how can we stop states from doing this? I'm like, well, it depends what you have on the day, because if I was to get really specific as well, it would be based on, well, what is technologically in play today, which could be out of date in 15 years. So this is much more conceptual, really, about the service loss of celestial lines of communications between satellites and users. And it doesn't really matter the exact makeup of your satellites. It's up to you as an individual and your scenario to know specifically what these concepts mean for you. So I'm not going to tell you exactly what all of this means for you, but hopefully this book will give you the tools to figure that out for yourself in a constructive manner. So I'm not just sort of telling people what to think about space, but hopefully how to think about space warfare as well.
So that's my blue book to be the next dictator.
No, I mean, this makes no comments about politics and ethics. Okay. It's very sort of Clausewitzian that it's about fighting the war.
Okay. One question about Europe. Where is Europe in all of that? Can we even find it? I mean, of course, NATO calls the fifth domain now, also want to play with the big boys, but where are we?
So I don't really talk specifically about any space powers other than Chinese, Taiwanese, and American military space capabilities, because that's the case I have at the end to sort of apply the theory at. So I don't make any such comments specifically about Europe, broadly defined, but sort of the book ends really sort of the intro and the conclusion. I talk about are we in a more multipolar order in space? So if any of you who do or study international relations will be familiar with debates of the decline of America, or is this the end of unipolarity? And I take issue with a lot of discussion in international relations which sort of black boxes or ignores space technology. So I say, I'm not sure if we're in a bipolar system with America and China, but if you look at what Europe, Japan, India, and some other countries as well, to a lesser extent, and also Russia as well in terms of space, I'm not comfortable calling it unipolar or bipolar. Maybe it's more multipolar, I don't know. But then again, what does it actually mean in practice? Well, a lot more countries have a lot more options for forum shopping, or to have access to high-tech technologies, or to pursue other paths of high-tech development. And the discussions of the world order always gets more complicated when you pick a particular spread of technologies, and that's no different in space. So I see Europe, personally, I see Europe still as one of the major centers of space technology in the world. So you can't ignore Europe. But then in terms of Europe in military space, it's much more on a individual state basis as opposed to ESA or EU. Yeah. Although the EU, of course, is building, two significant space infrastructures, and of course massively supports the third one. So navigation, so Galileo, Copernicus, and then Arianespace. But the rest of the military stuff is very much member state orientated, and NATO relevant as well. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much. I mean, I feel a bit down now, but I think that this might be the topic
that international relations.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, I should be more careful in picking the topics here, but thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to come to an end because these 33 minutes are running fast, if you're fun. So be sure we will follow up on the space security topics in our future Space Café web talks, and in the announcement on the next slides, you will also see a number of people talking about it. Today, later, there's another event at 7 p.m. with the Serbian Case for Space on how to start your career in space, in the space industry. It will be in Serbian language, moderated by Anja Pikulic and Marko Pajovic. And our next regular web talks are on the 7th of July. Sebastian Moranta from the ESPI will be my guest to talk about European space industry after COVID-19. On the 14th of July, Jenny Tapio, one of the space specialists at the Finnish government, will talk with me about the implementation of national space law for Finland and beyond. And on 21st of July, I'm happy to announce that Niklas Hetman, Chief of the Committee, Policy and Legal Affairs Section of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs in Vienna, will be my guest to talk with me on the new frontiers and space multilateralism. And I think that goes perfectly on the diplomatic route where we just left off. All events are online on Eventbrite already. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. We really need your support, also as potential sponsors for these web talks here, so please get in touch with us as well. And thank you all for your interest today. And thank you, Bleddyn, for this exciting talk and being my guest and give us this. I think it's more than just food for thoughts. I mean, these are really facts. And as you said, we report there when the shooting starts. Yeah, that takes some time. And thanks again to my entire team behind the scenes for doing that great job week by week again. I hope you all will be safe and stay safe and stay healthy, even on lockdown. So thank you for joining us. Hope to see you next week. In the meantime, visit our website or follow us on social media. media. With that, bye-bye here from Switzerland, virtually. Take care. Bye.